Welcome, everyone. I'm Mimi Kaiser with Emory University, the Interfaith Health Program here. I want to welcome Greetings and welcome. I'm Mimi Kaiser at the Interfaith Health Program at Emory University. I welcome you to our fourth webinar in a series of four. This one on the distinctives of faith-based health providers for HIV and AIDS response, faith communities and faith-based organizations. This is a webinar hosted and supported by the UNAIDS faith-based joint initiative. And we are the hosts are the academic consortium represented by Emory University, University of Cape Town, and St. Paul's University. I'll turn the presentation over now to my colleague John Blevins at Emory University. He'll introduce himself, a background on the initiative, and launch us into the presentation, and then welcome Professor Esther Mambo from St. Paul's University to join in the presentation as well. We will touch base at the end and provide information about any follow-up and continuing learning, and we appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Hello, everyone. My name is John Blevins. I am on the faculty in the School of Public Health at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health. Our institution is one of other universities that comprise the academic consortium of the joint initiative on strengthening collaboration with faith-based partners, sponsored by the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS, and the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. The joint initiative is now in its third year and is a multi-sectoral initiative looking at a number of capacity and programmatic contexts for the distinctive roles and contributions of faith-based partners to maintain the progress made and to further the progress made in global efforts to address HIV disease around the world, and to continue pointing us toward a vision to the elimination of HIV and AIDS in the world. This webinar series is a series of 4 webinars that was developed at the request of various implementing partners as part of the joint initiative to provide technical information and evidence on the distinctive contributions of the faith-based sector, both faith-based providers and local faith-based community organizations and local religious communities. Global funders such as PEPFAR and UNAIDS are now aware and have been convinced of the contributions and the essential role of faith-based partners in their efforts. And now it is beholden to those partners to demonstrate their technical capacity and their administrative and programmatic capacity to carry out the work. So this initiative is the webinar series provides information on topics that implementing partners from the faith-based sector ask the academic consortium to develop. As Mimi mentioned, this is the 4th of 4 webinars. It ties in directly with the 3rd webinar, which was held 4 weeks ago. And in both of these webinars, we look at the distinctive resources and aspects of evidence related to those resources of faith-based partners. Webinar 3 looked at that in the context of faith-based health providers providing direct HIV clinical care and services, and faith-based health systems, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This webinar focuses on the contributions of faith-based providers working in the community sector and working to provide HIV prevention and support services, as well as the ministries and efforts of local congregations, local mosques, temples, and other religious communities in supporting people who are living with or affected by HIV. This webinar has 5 learning objectives. One is to describe the history of research on the distinctive characteristics of faith-based organizations. In large part for that objective, we will be looking at some of the arguments and some of the perspectives that Dr. Olivier from University of Cape Town provided us last month. The second is to summarize distinctive characteristics of faith-based organizations and their impact, particularly faith-based organizations working at the community rather than the clinical level. To distinguish between anecdote and evidence, so having laid out what the contributions are, to provide an overview of data and academic writing that supports those distinctive characteristics, and to highlight the importance of building that knowledge base and not relying on anecdotal claims alone. To develop various messages on FBO distinctives for various audiences and various purposes. How can religious communities and religious leaders speak to different audiences, such as the society at large, to government and civil society leaders, to congregants and local communities on compassionate care and support for people living with HIV? And then finally, what would it take to build a capacity for research and academic work, both formal and informal, to document the impact of faith-based organizations and faith communities? So with those objectives in mind, we'll turn now to the first objective, a history into the research into the distinctives of faith-based organizations. For a number of years in the late 20th century, a growing group of researchers in public health and international development began to advocate clearly for the distinctive and the substantial contributions of faith-based partners to public health and international economic and social development efforts, and to make the case that those distinctive contributions had largely been overlooked by global level policymakers and funders involved in leading efforts and setting priorities for those fields. We're at a different point at this point in the 21st century, and we have made that case and have been in lots of ways quite successful at making that case. And there is now committed and sustained efforts on the part of global policymakers and global funders to engage faith-based partners in comprehensive and in ongoing and sustained ways. And those efforts have borne fruit in lots of ways. One of the unintended consequences of those early advocacy efforts may have been, however, that we relied on anecdotal claims about the scale and scope of the contributions of our faith-based organizations and faith-based health systems and providers in providing general health services and HIV services in particular. And in doing so, we did not always have evidence to back up those claims. And so there's a long and broad history that Dr. Olivier walked us through last month on anecdotal claims, both by faith advocates and by policymakers in the global context, on the scope of the contributions of faith-based partners. But it may be in some ways that we've overpromised or we've overclaimed what those contributions are, not with any negative intention on our part, but just to make the case that the contributions of our partners are quite substantive. And now we're at the place that we're having to back up those anecdotal claims with evidence. That's actually a very complex research agenda, as Dr. Olivier mentioned to us last week. It involves not simply counting percent of services or numbers of beds or the scope of the geographic reach of faith-based health providers, but also, in order to fully understand the impact of faith-based health providers, to also measure the ways in which faith-based providers compare to providers from other sectors, governmental and private sector providers, in regard to quality of care, patient satisfaction, cost, geographic reach, reach to most vulnerable communities, a number and host of issues. And that's a research agenda that's just beginning to be articulated and beginning to be explored. There still remains a large group of policymakers and providers in global HIV circles who have also articulated, and quite often for legitimate and important reasons, the negative influences of religion in regard to HIV prevention, treatment, and support services. People who were skeptical of the contributions of faith-based organizations often argue that most often religion is a barrier to comprehensive, evidence-based HIV prevention and sexual and reproductive health initiatives, and that the social force of religion and of religious communities and faith-based providers is largely one that presents a barrier to comprehensive HIV programs and services. And so we find ourselves in a rather odd kind of either-or dynamic of one camp within the world of global health and global HIV and faith-based partnerships, arguing strongly that faith-based partners are essential and distinctive partners in efforts, and another group working in global HIV efforts, arguing that faith communities and religion as a social force is a significant barrier. And in reality, research demonstrates that both of those claims have validity depending on context and depending on population, depending on the kind of program that is being examined. So that's the context on the public health side. In the context of religious circles themselves, among religious leaders and religious scholars and theologians from various religious traditions, HIV has demanded a response from faith communities that requires them to look at and sometimes to engage in very sharp debates on questions of sexuality and gender. The social dynamics and the social forces that contribute to vulnerability for people who are living with HIV to experience social isolation, or that may contribute to those who are at risk for HIV to become infected, are not simply clinical issues or biomedical or issues or topics that the health sciences alone can understand and address. They're complicated social cultural issues, and religion is a social cultural force in the midst of all that. And religion's teachings on human sexuality, issues of homosexuality, and issues of gender inequity or gender equality and equity are important aspects of the debates in which religious communities have engaged to understand how to offer compassionate care and pastoral care to people who are living with HIV and AIDS. Those theological debates have led to new kinds of commitments and new kinds of insights in some corners of religious communities and among some religious groups, and sharp divisions and debates among religious organizations, denominations, and religious bodies that continues to play out, has historically played out since the 1980s, since the early years of the epidemic, and continues even to play out today in global religious communities and context. The other thing that's been front and center in the context of religious communities, both for religious leaders and for religious scholars from various religious traditions, is the question of advocacy. How can you articulate a claim based on the teachings and principles and doctrines and commitments of a religious tradition for compassionate care and support for people who are living with or affected by HIV and AIDS? And that advocacy has a long history of beginning in global organized ways as early as the early 1980s. If the first case of HIV, of what became eventually was called HIV, first came into being in 1981, the first global bodies of religious organizations to meet to address and to articulate a faith response to this new infection or newly discovered infection occurred in 1983. And so there's an early history of advocacy to the public at large and advocacy for compassion and care to faith communities themselves. The role of religious leaders in advocacy in this day and age for continued funding and continued support for to maintain and even to grow global responses to the epidemic is one of the important priorities and focuses of the Joint United Nations PEPFAR collaborative, this initiative. And so the question of advocacy, both to local communities, to the society at large, and to governments, both national and global governmental bodies, continues to be an important issue within religious communities themselves. Next slide. So I want to talk about the ways in which faith-based organizations and local faith communities carry out programs and have an impact at a social level along 4 dimensions: the dimension of social support, the dimension of social regulation, the dimension of social capital, and the question of religious communities' vision or mission. I want to thank a colleague here at Emory, Ellen Eidler, who's a sociologist who coordinates Emory's Religion and Public Health Collaborative, for her framework in light of the first 3 of these dimensions: social support, social regulation, and social capital, and religion's function and its impact on health in those contexts. So I'll walk briefly through each of these. Next slide. In each of them, I talk about them in the context both of religious beliefs and religious practices, recognizing that religious beliefs may be formally articulated by people of faith, and they may be a taken for granted way of seeing the world that a religious tradition provides someone inside of that tradition, even if that person has a hard time articulating in formal ways the aspects of teachings or beliefs that guide their way of seeing the world. And then to think about religion not just as an activity of the mind or of the head, but also something that impacts the way we go about living our daily lives, both as individuals and in social context and social communities. And so religion impacts our practices. And so for each of these 4 elements, I'll talk briefly about dimensions of them in regard to beliefs and in regard to practices. For social support, religious teachings can be an important and concrete and explicit kind of ground or foundation for providing a way to articulate and to be committed to caring for those who are in need. A religious justification or a religious kind of foundation of the importance of support for those at risk or those living with HIV can be quite powerful by being articulated out of the framework of a social institution such as religion that has a great deal of social power and community power at all levels, at individual, family, community, and social levels. And similarly, religious teachings and religious beliefs and practices can be barriers to social support, because if religious teachings are used to justify stigmatization for people who are living with or affected by HIV and AIDS, those messages can be quite powerful in their social force. In regard to practices, social support can provide a framework. Religious communities can provide a framework for offering social support to people living with and or affected by HIV that's more than individual care, although that can be quite important and be carried out by people of faith individually. It provides a community context for providing support to people living with HIV when carried out through religious communities themselves. Likewise, if religious communities are not supportive, people living with HIV who are parts of those communities may expend a significant amount of personal, emotional energy in their own lives to maintain the secret of their HIV status, which can carry an emotional toll, can have an impact on continued access of continued ability to access care and to stay in care or to adhere to medication regimens. This toll of the secret can be quite large. The next issue is social regulation. In regard to beliefs, religion provides a framework and a foundation for articulating moral teachings and moral positions. In the context of HIV, this is most often seen in regard to religious teachings related to human sexuality, related to questions of gender justice and gender equity, related to questions of drug and alcohol use, all of which have implications for the ways in which risk behaviors for HIV carry out or carry with them a certain kind of moral frame that's quite often makes them more than just health behaviors, but behaviors that have been given a certain kind of moral cast in communities and in societies. Those moral teachings can vary widely. They can vary from being a clearly articulated of compassion and a prophetic call to justice, to a perspective that people who are living with HIV are simply facing the consequences of their own sin, and their sin has come home to roost in HIV infection. And in regard to practices, social regulations, moral teachings that provide social regulations don't just give us a set of rules, they do more than that. They create a kind of ethos or a way of understanding what's right and wrong in the world more broadly. And those beliefs are not merely individual, they shape social patterns and they establish corporate commitments in local communities. So social regulation has an impact not just at individual levels, but at community and social levels as well. The third dimension is in regard to social capital. Social capital is simply a way of thinking about the kinds of power that are made, that's possible through social relationships, through the kinds of relationships we have, and how those relationships enable and create certain kinds of networks and ways of relating to one another, where corporate support can allow certain things to get done, or if we find ourselves quite isolated and not deeply embedded in a number of relationships, the ways in which we lack significant social capital to carry out similar kinds of things at a social or community level. In regard to beliefs, social relationships are created through and then subsequently further or underwrite trust. One of the ways in which faith communities generate social capital is by being sites where individuals place trust in the points of view, the teachings, the way of living, both of religious leaders and religious communities. And that begins to feed on itself in ways of generating further trust and generating further social capital. Likewise, if that trust is violated or is suspect and called into question, the social capital, both of religious leaders and of faith communities, varies and can lessen. In regard to practices, relationships playing out across a faith community generate social networks, allowing for the generation of a variety of material resources. For example, the financial support for HIV ministries, the mobilization of volunteers, those kinds of material resources that social capital makes available as material capital is an important kind of distinctive of faith communities. It also allows for an advocacy role that we mentioned before. Advocacy in partnership with those living with HIV, advocacy in local faith communities, and advocacy in the public at large, both civil society and governmental. And then finally, the vision and mission of faith-based organizations and local religious communities will not be limited to HIV and AIDS alone, but the overall vision and mission as it relates to HIV services provides an important framework for underwriting and justifying faith responses to HIV, whether those responses are positive and beneficial and in furtherance of care for people living with HIV, or whether they're negative. A vision and sense of mission are intrinsic to our beliefs, and they can't be articulated without some form of belief in grounding commitments. So secular organizations have visions and missions as well, and may articulate them formally, but even if they don't articulate them formally, civil society organizations and public health responses to HIV are also grounded in sets of visions and sense of mission as to what's important and what the grounding commitments are. But for faith communities, that vision and mission is articulated in distinctive ways that have a distinctive kind of social power as being tied to theological positions and beliefs about the nature of a faith community and the divine. And in regard to practices, religious communities will differ significantly from other social institutions in regard to their motivation. They may not be present in local communities only on the basis of funding streams or funding opportunities, but they may be an intrinsic part of those communities because they're a local worshiping faith community that's part of a broader community, and they're there not on the basis of a grant or of a funding stream, but on the basis of a community's response to worship. and they have staying power based on that motivation. It's not contingent on those funding structures alone. At the same time, funding to faith-based organizations and through the ministries of local religious communities allows and makes possible certain kind of things that creates a certain kind of expectation of the need and the importance for funding. And so funding becomes a difficult or a complicated topic to negotiate. Next slide. Before I move on to talk about a fourfold framework for assessing religion in regard to the distinctives of religion, I wondered if Professor Mambo had any comments on these dimensions. Professor Mambo, I'm not trying to put you on the spot in regard to these four. I just wondered if at this point there was something that you thought was quite important to these four dimensions that I just went through that I failed to articulate and that you wanted to bring up.
Thank you so much, John. I think the characteristics that you have given are significant, but it's also important to note that in both social support, social regulation, and social capital, that the gender angle is quite strong. When you think of the social support, you do find that women, for example, provide that very much. When it comes to social regulations, you do find that the leadership of faith-based communities, especially the churches, do provide leadership that is regulations that sometimes is disconnected with the social support. Because for the women, the issue is how they care for the dying, for example. But the social regulations are provided in terms of what people think about the text and what you did say about their relationship with the divine. In terms of the social capital, therefore, what you do find is that women do put in much more in regard to their emotional and material and even physical time in providing the support for those that are affected. The women do not take part in the mission and vision in terms of writing it, but they are forced to be enjoined in it, to provide, to practice it. But there is a disconnect between what the vision and mission may say and what the practice would be. That's the distinctive that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mambo. That's a great segue into this next section because a number of those questions of negotiation that you just described in the context of gender come up in these frameworks as well. So thank you for that. And I neglected, and my apologies, Professor Mambo, for doing this. I neglected to introduce you at the beginning. Professor Esther Mambo is on the faculty in theology at St. Paul's University in Limuru, Kenya. It is the oldest and one of the largest schools of theological study in Eastern Africa. And Professor Mambo is the principal investigator for St. Paul's in regard to the work of the academic consortium and the joint collaborative. She's a well-respected feminist theologian at St. Paul's and beyond St. Paul's through a variety of partnerships with global ecumenical bodies, including the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, and through consultative work in global bodies such as the World Council of Churches and other ecumenical and interfaith initiatives. Esther, how did I do? Would you like to add anything in terms of your introduction?
No, that is enough, John. Thank you so much.
I'll go on now to talk about this framework for assessing religion's influence along four dimensions. The first is belief and practices. Next slide. I've already talked about beliefs and practices in regard to the fourfold framework related to social analysis, support, regulation, capital, and vision and mission. But I want to talk a bit more about this and give some examples of why it's important in regard to HIV. The theme of beliefs and practices examines the ways in which religious beliefs relate to HIV prevention and treatment initiatives. Examples may include, but they're not just these examples, there are others beyond it, but here are three kinds of examples. Religious teachings and doctrines on human sexuality or on gender and the kinds of sexual behaviors that are acceptable or unacceptable for different people in a religious tradition will have an impact on how HIV prevention messages are received within religious communities and in the society at large. Religious prohibitions against condom use, which are part of some religious communities, and the theological claims that underwrite such prohibitions will have an impact on the ways in which some kinds of faith-based organizations can or cannot provide comprehensive HIV prevention programs that include the use of condoms, or sermons that provide a theological frame that would exhort people in a religious tradition to be loving and compassionate to people living with HIV or affected by HIV would be an example of how religious belief can be oriented toward compassionate care. This theme also examines relationships between religious beliefs and the variety of practices that are part of their life, both explicit religious practices such as worship or prayer and non-religious practices. Next slide. And so it looks at people's daily life practices and the relationship between those practices and belief. It's important to note that beliefs and practices rarely completely align for anyone inside of any religious tradition, but they're best understood as a kind of series of negotiations. Doctrinal positions or formal pronouncements of religious leaders or religious bodies may be positions that individual people of faith inside of that kind of religious tradition do not accept as correct or true or valid for themselves, and people will negotiate a different kind of relationship both in regard to their practice and in regard to the principles or teachings of religious leaders or religious bodies. And that happens in various religious traditions. Examples may include, but again, not to be limited to, being in a sexual relationship that might be in tension with or in alignment with the stated beliefs of a religious tradition, and how one negotiates that as a person of faith inside of that tradition. It might involve choosing to use a condom even if your religious community or religious tradition prohibits it, or encouraging condom use in others even if your tradition prohibits their use. What does that negotiation look like on an intellectual level for people and on an emotional level? And it might include showing kindness to a person living with HIV because your tradition teaches you to do so. So this theme provides insights into the effects of religious teachings on HIV programs and policies, as well as the relationship between religious belief and practice at both individual and cultural levels. Number 2, organizational structure. This theme has 2 dimensions. The first examines the structure and the function of a religious community. For example, a local congregation, a masjid, or a temple, or of a local faith-based organization. How is that entity, that institution, organized, intrinsic to itself? The first element is largely an intrinsic or internal analysis. What is its organizational system? Who has authority within that community, in that body? Those are kinds of questions in this first dimension. The second dimension examines the ways in which religious communities or other kinds of faith-based organization relate to broader religious authorities and to the society at large. Does a religious community have some freedom to determine its own policies and positions on issues that might be controversial, or is it beholden to follow the dictates and the doctrines of religious leaders and the pronouncements of those authorities? Faith-based responses to HIV often reveal some level of tension between the activities of local faith-based organizations working with people living with HIV, the stated positions of religious authorities on a variety of theological issues, again, to use an example, condoms as a tool, and local religious leaders or communities who are welcoming of people living with HIV. So this theme examines the various ways in which faith-based organizations and religious communities negotiate these kinds of tensions, not at an individual level of belief and practice, but at a corporate and organizational level of religious community or local faith-based NGO. Examples might include an FBO that's affiliated with Roman Catholicism offering condoms to program participants. Is that FBO is it independent with its own board, or is it a program of the ecclesial structure of the Roman Catholic Church. In the United States, the Catholic Medical Missions Board is an example of an independent organization, and Catholic Relief Services is an example of an organization that is directly organizationally tied to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I'm not saying anything about the policies, positions, or practices of either CMMB or CRS in relation to condoms, but I'm talking about their organizational relationship to religious authority. Another kind of example would be a congregation or religious leader that's affirming of LGBTQI individuals when the religious authorities of that tradition may not offer such affirmation. How does that congregation negotiate its own position in light of the teachings and positions of the larger religious body? Or how does an individual religious leader, either ordained or lay, do so when a larger body has a different position? It might include the organizational capacities and limits of a small grassroots faith-based organization that can work very effectively in a specific context related to the particular needs and context out of which it arose, but it may not have the existing capacity to take that kind of innovation to a larger national scale. This issue is actually a fairly common issue to address as organizations seek funding to take grassroots initiatives beyond the grassroots to have a broader impact at larger, more macro levels. And so this theme is useful for understanding that what kinds of faith-based organizations and local religious communities and leaders are best suited to meet the needs of various groups and various contexts to address HIV at local, regional, national, and global levels. Third element is the relationship of a religious community or faith-based organization to broader society. This theme examines the extent to which FBOs, religious leaders in those communities work with other leaders and organizations, both governmental and civil society. Some religious traditions believe such collaboration aligns with their overall mission, that they can partner and work side by side with people of different faith traditions or who don't profess a faith tradition on shared programs and initiatives that reflect the religious community's own value. Conversely, other religious communities believe in the importance of separating themselves from organizations or from social context in order to protect themselves from what they see to be the errors in teaching or dangerous ideas in the society at large that might threaten their own religious worldview. So how does a religious organization, religious leader, or faith community understand their relationship to a broader society? These very different positions reflect different theological ideas about the nature of society and about a religious community or a religious organization's place within that broader society. Examples might include a religious leader who serves as a spokesperson on the rights of people living with HIV and AIDS in public setting, or a faith-based organization that works with civil society organizations to advocate on behalf of key populations, maybe to carry out harm reduction initiatives or to work with sex workers on HIV prevention initiatives. Those would both be examples of religious communities that work in collaboration and partnership with broader society structures and activities. A different kind of example would be a religious leader who denounces Western models of HIV treatment as contrary to God's will, that God is the primary and final healer and arbiter of our health, and relying on Western models of treatment signifies a lack of faith in God's sovereignty and in God's power. So this theme is useful for understanding how HIV prevention and treatment programs that are sponsored by governmental or by international donor organizations are perceived and supported or not supported by religious communities and FBOs. And then finally, the fourth dimension is how individuals themselves use religion to leverage power. This theme examines the ways in which people living with HIV or their advocates use religious faith and practice to challenge stigma that they may face and the social context broadly that they face in their daily lives, even if that social context that might be problematic for example, a stigmatizing context, is itself grounded in religion? How can religion be a social force to speak out against stigmatization, even religiously motivated stigmatization? Some examples might include people living with HIV forming their own religious communities or religious organizations, or developing their own context for communal religious practice, forming a Bible study, for example, because their local religious community does not speak about HIV or speaks about HIV in a stigmatizing or judgmental way. Decisions by people living with HIV to leave one religious community and to be part of a different religious community, or maybe to leave religion behind altogether. Or the leader of a faith-based organization that supports key populations efforts, making a religious or theological case for the work of their organization, knowing that that position will elicit sharp disagreement from other religious leaders. An analysis of this theme helps us understand the ways in which people living with HIV may use religion to lessen stigma, or a religious leader, her or himself, using religious teachings to make a case to support people living with HIV and AIDS. Such efforts may even, and in fact they often do, involve using religion to respond to and to refuse religious expression that's stigmatizing or condemning. So before I move on to the evidence behind all of these kinds of dimensions that I've named, and doing a quick kind of very cursory literature review on evidence to support these kind of claims, Professor Mambo, I wondered if you had any comments or thoughts on those 4 dimensions that you might want to add.
Yes, John, thank you so much. I think one, you've mentioned the fact that there is a lot of negotiation that goes on at individual level and even at the organizational level. 2 other things that go on in this kind of work is the question of subversion. You will find that even if it is not publicly said, that many of the things that will be going on, particularly by the people who are living with HIV, are actually forms of subverting the very regulations that are put against them, especially those within the key populations. And secondly, is the question of survival. How do you survive in these realities where discrimination is very high and religion is being used to discriminate? What forms or means does one use to survive in that context? That's what you find in terms of the double life. That there is one that you live in the public, and there is the one that you live in private. So the 3 aspects, the fact of negotiation, the fact of subverting the very system, and also seeking ways of surviving in that particular system. So you have multiple identities, and that's what you find sometimes with people living with HIV or people who are within the key population.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Mambo. I look forward to the discussion both with you and with the other participants in a few moments on those kinds of issues. And we'll get to that. Let me just briefly walk through some resources to help you to see participants to be able to read further on these kind of claims and to see evidence of their function in regard to HIV. In regard to the dimension of social support, there are a number of qualitative studies that indicate that faith-based providers enjoy greater trust when compared to providers from other sectors. You've got 2 listed here. For those of you who were on the call last month, these resources and these citations may be familiar. I used a number of them in the presentation last month. In regard to social control and social regulation, Helen Epstein's work on the ways in which religion has complicated HIV prevention efforts in sub-Saharan African context, and the ways in which it becomes politicized both within funding structures out of the West and in cultural context about the proper relationship in culture between Western perspectives and both governmental and civil society and religious perspectives of people of faith in various sub-Saharan contexts. She makes conducts an interesting kind of analysis in her book. Scott Everts, who was the Director of National AIDS Policy in the second Bush White House, articulated a critique of the ways in which PEPFAR had been overtaken by religious ideology that undermined evidence-based prevention science measures in PEPFAR, and wrote a critique of PEPFAR in the ways that social regulation was not helpful in the context of HIV prevention. And then professor of communication at Moi University in Kenya, and also a professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, have looked at the ways in which HIV prevention messages are not so much prevention messages in the context of health sciences or prevention sciences, but they set up a moral discourse of right and wrong kinds of sexual behaviors that have a different function than HIV prevention, but about social regulation or social control. Social capital capacities by faith-based organizations are supplemented by robust services by faith-based health providers, are supplemented by robust services at community level and among local congregations. For example, congregations can mobilize volunteer for community initiatives, but these initiatives can be difficult to coordinate, and measuring the impact and their effect has been difficult. But the UN, UNICEF, and Religions for Peace has conducted a study on this to look at the contributions of local faith communities in caring for orphans and vulnerable children, including children orphaned from HIV and AIDS, and documents that the greatest level of support and service that faith-based organizations or the faith-based sector provides happens at a congregational level and not at the level of the faith-based NGO. Next slide. In regard to mission and vision and the ways in which mission and vision translate into material assistance, FBOs provide material support to poor individuals and families, most often through congregational structures. Again, UNICEF and the Conference of Religions for Peace in their 2004 report speaks of the scope of that material support. FBOs may also provide program capacity to reach poor and socially isolated communities, particularly in contexts where governmental policies may have presented a structural kind of challenge to providing care. We here at Emory worked for a number of years in informal settlements in Nairobi in coordination with St. Paul's in Kenya, and found that that local faith communities were the greatest conduits of health resources and social and economic development and educational resources and programs, far more than local government, in providing those services to the residents of informal settlements around Nairobi. Financial support of HIV programs is substantial. UNICEF in 2012 estimated that faith communities provide $5 billion for HIV programs annually through offerings and faith and donations, and that this equals the funding of annual funding of all both bilateral and multilateral donors for responding to HIV and AIDS. But that shifts in funding and shifts in funding priorities or policies by global funders can be disruptive to FBOs. I worked with Christoph Ben from the Global Fund and with Sandra Thurman from PEPFAR to conduct an analysis on a special issue of a journal that Dr. Olivier from University of Cape Town edited that looked at those kinds of funding questions. In regard to a framework for assessing religion in regard to beliefs and practices, I simply placed here two different pieces. One looks at how African traditional spiritualities and religious beliefs and their social and cultural influence and power play out in the negotiation of agency and blame, and how local communities rely on a variety of religious positions to exercise agency in the context of blame. A piece by colleagues from South Africa, Paul Germond, who's an Anglican priest and a sociologist, and Jim Cochran, who's now retired from the Department of Religious Studies at University of Cape Town, in which they spell out the idea of how a Western framework of understanding health, what Paul and Jim call a health world, is a quite different health world from the health world of local people living on the ground in all kinds of parts of the world. And in their field work, Paul and Jim lay that out in some field work done in Lesotho and Zambia to demonstrate that the health world of health policymakers and public health researchers is quite different in regard to HIV from the health world of people who were living with or affected by HIV. Organizational structure, we have a case study analysis of a local congregation here in the United States in the citation there that looks at how local congregations in Baltimore address HIV, and then a broader kind of framework for understanding how religious non-governmental organizations and their structure allows for certain kinds of capacities and certain kinds of activities to be carried out. In regard to the relationship to broader society, I've written a piece that looks at a historical event in the late 1880s in what is now present-day Uganda, and the ways in which that's been, that historical event has been articulated in contemporary debates around human sexuality and homosexuality and HIV prevention in Uganda, and to a certain extent more broadly across Eastern African context. Ruth Prince, who's an anthropologist, looks at the ways in which both traditional Christian teachings and Luo traditional beliefs and practices about life and death have impacted the ways that Luo people in Western Kenya negotiate intimate relationships, marriage, burial and death of spouses, and HIV infection and sexual practice and behavior, and create a certain kind of context for vulnerability for women in Luo communities. And then ways that individuals use religion to leverage power. Myself and a colleague from Kenya have looked at the ways in which certain public health prevention programs for men who have sex with men may have inadvertently created vulnerability for participants in those programs by looking at the ways in which one such group, the members of one such group experienced physical violence in their local community because of their participation, and the ways in which a certain kind of that religion function in the lives of those men as a resource for addressing the kind of social vulnerability that they faced. And Jarrett Zygon, who's an anthropologist out of the Netherlands, has looked at the ways in which HIV is a broad scale kind of health issue that actually generates a great deal of moral claims, both out of public health and out of religious context, for what we should be doing to respond in the right kinds of ways to HIV. And he actually argues that what is at stake here is a kind of set of competing moralities and the ways in which harm reduction approaches for people who use injection drugs play out in Russia between the Russian Orthodox Church and secular NGOs. So those are examples of research done around these issues. We have about 20 minutes left, and in the final 20 minutes, 15? Oh, I was looking at the wrong clock. Thank you. We have 15 minutes left. In the final 15 minutes, we'll turn to a facilitated discussion among any of us in the who are participating. Among participants on the call, is there any instruction as to how they could ask a question?
Yes, there's a to the left of your name under when you are seeing attendees. Next to your name, there are columns, and the column closest to you has a little hand. So if you click in the box, yes, David Barstow knows this well. You'll see how he's raising his hand, and then Tobias John has raised his hand. And so as you raise your hands, we'll take turns and unmute you and call upon you. So thank you for your questions. All right, David Barstow, you're up first.
Yeah, this is David Barstow. I'm wondering what kind of data we have about faith communities and the numbers of faith communities are, and I'll use words like helping or hurting. If we were to do a survey in a country like Kenya, for example, what would we find out? Would we find out that most of the faith communities are helping the HIV response? Most are hurting? Most are irrelevant? What kind of data do we have like that?
David, it's a great question, and others are welcome to weigh in as well. I'm not aware of a comprehensive survey that has been carried out in any kind of national context to look at the kinds of responses and to survey the kinds of responses of various faith communities, and to try and arrive at some percentage that offer compassionate perspectives versus the percent that offer condemnatory perspectives. It's an interesting question. It would be a really difficult study to capture, because just to try and articulate what the metrics for identifying compassionate versus condemning, what counts as a faith community, how do we know where they are? There's no central repository of faith community directory. So it's an interesting question, but I'm not aware of anything done at that kind of level or scale. Jill, I think you're on the line, and this is more your field on these kind of analyses in regard to the quantitative side. Do you know of anything that's been done in that regard?
Sure. It is an interesting question because it's a broad question, and it's quite a macro question, David. Sorry, the noise is behind me. And I think the answer is yes. If you're looking at something really specific like HPV vaccination, there are studies that have been done that have looked at the influence of religious attitudes on either uptake or vaccine resistance. And those have generally shown that that they haven't shown that religion is that there's more religious resistance. It's actually shown in a sense that actually the religion is almost a non-issue in that particular, that the things like culture and gender and education and all of these other kinds of things are wrapped up in that. So most of the studies show that it's a combination of factors that influence decisions around family planning. There'll be very few studies that will show that it's just religion that is the deciding factor on any particular issue. The flip side is if you're looking at issues like, if you're looking at things like service provision, that's almost like a totally different type of evidence that you're looking for. Then you might be saying, well, the kinds of faith engagement in HIV prevention is substantively outweighed by the massive contribution in relation to faith communities' involvements in not just HIV services, but also in the kind of informal community engagement work. And then there are studies that show that there's more active engagement than there is things working against. But it's a bit of an apples and oranges, isn't it? I mean, you have to kind of look for a very specific indicator and then a very specific faith community, and then try and compare them. But I would be reluctant to try and make some macro level statement about it on a global scale, for sure.
Thanks, Jill. Esther, did you have anything to add on that topic? Okay, thank you. Do we have I thought we had it. Was there another hand?
Yes, Tobias.
Tobias?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Tobias from Nigeria. I tried to look at the segregation between religion and community. And I come to realize in some specific location or communities in Nigeria, where you have the community drawing its norms and values from the religion practices, which guides what the community does and what it does not. And now coming to this point of trying to work on stigma, we find it difficult to draw a distinctive line between the community and other sectors. And again, even the non-governmental organization or the non-state actors that survive or strive within such communities, they are equally they have their origination from the same religion. Now, it's been a bit difficult for us to understand the methodology, to be able to come in and work towards reducing some negative aspect of religion in the fight against stigma. So I think this webinar should be able to, if we have other similar parameters in some communities around the globe, that other strategies have been deployed that had worked to be able to address stigma in these communities, that would be very helpful if that can be shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Did any comments or thoughts on that from any of the panelists? Esther, or any thoughts on what was just said about the Nigeria context?
I was just saying that I think on the earlier question, which Jill had responded to, that the communities are not static. What you discover is that the more information is brought out about HIV, you see changes going on. So it's not a question of either or, it's both and. That as communities engage in HIV, as communities understand more about HIV, and as communities question their own religious beliefs and culture, then you do find that you cannot say that these ones are static and these ones are mobile. I think there's no right or wrong answer in this particular sense, because communities are changing. They are changing realities of HIV even. In terms of what Tobias is saying, again, it really depends on the ways in which the texts, whether they are cultural or religious texts, are interpreted by the religious leaders. And that's where I do find the issues around subversion, that there can be things that the religious leaders hold strongly and say publicly, but people find ways and means of surviving, or ways and means of being subversive to the religious ideals that the religious leaders tell them. So the picture is not very clear. The picture is not green or rosy, but it's both encompasses both the negative and the positive sides.
Do we have any other hands raised? What came to my mind around the question that Tobias asked and what Esther just spoke on is how we continue to be in this either or bifurcated kind of framework about religion and community. And it strikes me how I had submitted a paper for publication, a scholarly paper for publication, and an outside reviewer raised a question as to how I was framing religion and wasn't it really culture. And the reviewer's point about it was, in a variety of contexts across sub-Saharan Africa, where community workshops had been carried out to talk about childhood mortality, the workshops were not carried out in congregations or in local masjid. And so this reviewer said, well, it's not religion because it's happening in the community. But what people were talking about were religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs. And this kind of sense of, from one framework, we want to isolate religion to only be something we can measure from certain kinds of institutional context or barriers. And then the other side is that other kinds of practitioners and researchers see religion operative in quite broad ways across cultures and societies, and have made the case of its importance, which I agree with, but don't always take into account the negative effects of religion for some communities who are marginalized or stigmatized and only see religion as providing the only framework for articulating the points of view of a community. And as Esther and Jill before said, it's a both and kind of thing, that there are a variety of social forces that impact the way we think about these kinds of issues, and there are a variety of effects of religion and of faith communities in regard to either being supported places or stigmatizing places. And so I think we have to take religion seriously without becoming apologists that it's always doing the best and most important thing. Sometimes what religion carries out is not in support of some communities who are stigmatized. David Barstow had another question.
Yeah, in the first two webinars in this series, you talked about the logic model.
Yep.
And I was wondering if there are some good examples of use of the logic model specifically with respect to faith communities and HIV.
It's a great question. Again, Jill may know more about this, and Esther may as well. Than I'm not aware of any examples of logic models that have been published that lay out how a local faith community, if we think of that as a congregation or a temple or a masjid, has developed their own faith ministry, their own HIV ministry. I do think that a logic model could be a useful tool for a congregation to do that. There are certainly logic models that faith-based organizations have developed. Logic models tend not to get published, so we don't necessarily know what logic models are. They tend to be more internal documents to guide a program and to be able to assess how you're making progress toward achieving your objectives and your goals. So I'm not aware of any, David, that are at the level of local religious communities. Esther or Jill, do you know of any?
So, John, like you're saying, I haven't seen sort of a published journal article that has a logic model in it. However, there are a number of articles which are studies, which are evaluation studies of faith community interventions, which have a logic model both descriptively and also within the project documentation, within the supporting documentation. So there are a number of those, including, for example, some articles on World Vision's Channels of Hope. There's some articles on, on interventions with local faith communities. That's where you would see logic models coming up. There are quite a few in relation to HIV in America, in the United States, a lot on kind of HIV congregational interventions that speak to, that describe the logic model, but probably don't have the diagram in the article. And the other resource, David, is there are quite a lot of evaluation reports that are actually publicly available. You just have to go looking for them on funder websites. And in those evaluation reports, you would normally find, so for example, the evaluation reports on community system strengthening interventions around HIV engagement through the Global Fund, and they would have logic models in them. Whether or not every single impact and output is explicitly measured is different per project. But yes, there is still a need for more of that, and there certainly is a need for more publicly available evaluation outputs to be shared more openly, because very often they are kept internal to interventions.
Thank you, Jill.
We have a really wonderful question from Gabriel in Nigeria. And Gabriel, I think we will, I'll read the question out loud and then
a quick response.
And then a quick response from this group. So Gabriel has asked, have we encountered situations where you encounter fundamental differences in values between religious and health leaders that lead them in different directions on HIV prevention, and as a result limit their ability to work collaboratively? Have we encountered those, and if so, how did we respond?
I'll speak, and then if others want to speak, and to briefly say, yes, I've encountered them, and I think we see that play out. I do think that one of the challenges in regard to how we respond more helpfully to that is to try and turn the heat down around the ways that various sides will articulate a kind of all or nothing perspective on these kinds of questions, and experience the criticism or the critique or the challenge raised by the other side as something that actually hardens their own position. And I think that there are examples, and a number of examples, of when we move away from an all or nothing kind of position, where we are able to identify places of collaboration between those two groups, and to work on shared commitments in regard to HIV prevention or support, and to recognize that there are elements of possibly HIV prevention or support that are simply different between the two groups. The flip side of that challenge is in regard to deeply held beliefs, how to engage to find that common ground, and to be clear where you stand in regard to your own kinds of commitments and beliefs, whatever they might be, and how you keep a kind of a framework on where you stand in regard to both, and are kind of doing a self-assessment along those lines. That's actually a difficult position to be in, but it is possible. Esther or Jill or others, do you have examples of this question?
This is Jill. I think probably the best kind of summary of that is there was an article, a review article by Andrew Tompkins and others in The Lancet in 2015, which spoke about the controversies in faith in healthcare, and there were quite a few examples, evidence-based examples of kind of negative effect. So that would probably be, I would point you in that direction. Esther?
I think you're right in terms of the perceptions and attitudes of health workers towards religious groups, and also religious groups towards health workers. So that those perceptions sometimes do make it difficult. Sometimes it is even compounded by the multi-culturalism within a population. But as John said, it's like to help both the religious groups and the health workers to look inward and question their own perceptions towards the other, because both have strengths in regard to dealing with HIV. But those tensions are always there because of the perceptions of each other, or towards each other.
Well, we will now bring the webinar to a close. Thank you all very much for your participation. This ends the fourth in our series of 4, and if you have found this valuable or know others who might find it valuable, any of this one or any of the series, please make sure you go yourself or point people to the website where the webinars can be found, because there will be recordings of each of these webinars posted, and we hope that they can be shared widely and be useful to all of you. On behalf of the academic consortium here at Emory and St. Paul's University and the University of Cape Town, we thank you and wish you well.
Just one final note, that website where you can find the webinars is ihpemory.org. There's a link from the homepage of that website to all of the webinars in this series. Thank you for your participation in this one and in the others, and we wish you well.